A treaty signed in Europe. A continent changed forever. In 1648, deep in the heart of war-torn Europe, diplomats and warlords gathered to end what had become one of the bloodiest and most devastating conflicts in European history, the 30 Years' War. After prolonged negotiation, they signed the Treaty of Westphalia, a landmark moment that redefined international relations and gave birth to the concept of the modern sovereign state. The treaty was designed to protect kingdoms, enforce borders, and prevent foreign interference. But what it truly created was an exclusive political club, a model of international order that served Europe and ignored the rest of the world. Africa was never invited. At the time, Africa was a continent teeming with rich kingdoms, empires, cultural systems, and trade networks. From the powerful Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa to the flourishing Islamic scholarship in Timbuktu. Yet none of these civilizations were considered legitimate players in the new global order. The Treaty of Westphalia would become a model for colonial domination, a system that empowered Europe and silenced Africa. This documentary explores that omission and its devastating consequences. How did a European treaty shape Africa's political destiny for centuries? Why did Africa inherit borders it didn't draw? And can Africa ever escape a system built without it? Let's begin the story where it was never told, from Africa's side of Westphalia. The origins of the Westphalian system. The 30 Years' War, Europe's apocalypse. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, was a religious and political war that devastated large parts of Central Europe, primarily the Holy Roman Empire. Catholics and Protestants slaughtered each other. Nations burned. Civilian populations were decimated. The war became so unbearable that all sides, eventually, had no choice but to sit down at the negotiation table. The result was the Treaty of Westphalia, or rather, a series of treaties signed in Munster and Osnabrück. But more than a peace agreement, Westphalia laid the groundwork for modern diplomacy. It introduced three core principles. State sovereignty, every state has authority over its territory without interference. Legal equality of states, each state, regardless of size or power, is equal under international law. Non-intervention, no state should interfere in the internal affairs of another. These principles ended religious warfare in Europe and solidified the concept of the nation-state. But they also marked the beginning of a system that excluded African political entities from global recognition. African kingdoms were not seen as sovereign equals. They were subjects to be traded, mapped, and later colonized. From Westphalia to colonial Africa. Europe unites to divide Africa. As Westphalian diplomacy stabilized Europe, it also encouraged expansion. The competition shifted to trade and empire. Colonial powers, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, turned their attention to Africa. When the Berlin Conference was held in 1884–85, it was modeled on the Westphalian idea of sovereign agreements. But instead of peace, it brought division. Africa was carved up without a single African present. Westphalia had created the legal and ideological tools to justify colonization. We are sovereign, they are not. We are civilized, they are primitive. We must bring order to chaos. This logic birthed brutal colonial regimes, rubber plantations in Congo, railways built with slave labor, and borders drawn with no regard for ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities. Case studies. DR Congo, a personal colony under King Leopold II, justified by European silence and legal sovereignty. Nigeria. A British administrative experiment that forced together hundreds of ethnicities under one artificial roof. Ghana and Senegal, economies transformed into export machines for the metropole. Africa's sovereignty dilemma after independence. Independence in name, Westphalia in practice. When African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, they did not inherit freedom, they inherited Westphalian containers. The new states had colonial borders, centralized governments, and Western constitutions. Most of them had never existed in their current form before colonization. The OAU Charter, 1963, enshrined colonial borders in the name of peace, a tragic necessity. but it also locked Africa into the very statehood model that had divided it. Problems arose. Secessionist movements, Biafra, Katanga, Eritrea, were suppressed in the name of sovereignty. Military coups claimed to protect the state, just as kings and princes did in Europe. Ethnic tensions flared because the borders did not reflect identity, only geography. Africa was now sovereign, but on European terms. Pan-Africanism versus Westphalia. The struggle for a united Africa. By the 1950s and 60s, as African countries gained independence, a wave of revolutionary thought swept across the continent. Pan-Africanism became a rallying cry. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and Haile Selassie understood that the independence of one state meant little without the liberation of the whole continent. But their vision went beyond just freedom from colonialism, it challenged the very Westphalian model of fragmented sovereignty. Kwame Nkrumah dreamed of a United States of Africa, a continental government with one military, one economy, one foreign policy. He feared that individual sovereignty, as defined by Europe, would divide Africa and make it vulnerable to foreign powers. Julius Nyerere promoted Ujamaa, an African form of socialism based on cooperation, not competition. He believed that sovereignty should come from community, not territory. Muammar Gaddafi, controversial but visionary, later pushed for a stronger African Union, a single currency, and an African passport. He argued that Westphalian divisions made Africa weak and exposed to neocolonialism. These ideas directly opposed Westphalian fragmentation. They envisioned continental sovereignty, a political unity rooted in shared history and culture, not colonial cartography. The African Union and the trap of sovereignty. The AU, a house built on faulty foundations? When the Organization of African Unity, OAU, became the African Union, AU, in 2002, it signaled a shift from independence to integration. But the AU was born within a global system still built on Westphalian rules. Despite ambitions for unity, the AU largely adheres to non-interference, sovereign respect, and rigid borders. This has caused paralysis in moments of crisis. In Sudan and South Sudan, ethnic violence escalated while the AU remained restrained. In Libya, the AU had no say as NATO bombed a member state, violating the very sovereignty it was meant to uphold. In Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, military coups were condemned, but not prevented. The AU talks unity, but acts Westphalian. Regional bodies like ECOWAS, SADC, and IGAD have occasionally taken stronger stances, particularly in military or economic issues. But even they are limited by their respect for sovereignty. The result? Inaction disguised as diplomacy. The afterlife of Westphalia Indiana African politics. Coups, crisis, and the colonial ghost. Today's African political landscape is haunted by post-colonial state fragility, itself a legacy of Westphalian design. Governments often struggle to control all their territories. Armed groups flourish in borderlands. Coups reoccur because power is concentrated in presidential palaces rather than shared. And yet, the international community continues to treat these states as unitary, legitimate, and sovereign, because that's what Westphalia demands. Key examples. South Sudan, won independence in 2011, quickly descended into civil war. The state existed on paper, not in practice. Ethiopia, one of Africa's oldest civilizations, but Tigray conflict exposed deep divisions ignored by the central state model. Nigeria, despite massive resources and population, it remains fractured due to colonial fusion and centralized power. Meanwhile, foreign actors exploit Africa's vulnerabilities. China signs deals with authoritarian regimes for resources. France conducts military operations in West Africa. The US and Russia back proxies. In theory, Africa is sovereign. In practice, Westphalia protects foreign interests more than African people. Philosophy, identity and speculative thought. Ubuntu versus Westphalia. Westphalia is based on the idea of individualism, each state is a self-contained entity. Africa, by contrast, is rooted in Ubuntu, I am because we are. It emphasizes shared humanity, interdependence, and community-based governance. Where Westphalia sees a state as a territory with laws, Ubuntu sees a society of relationships. The two are fundamentally opposed. Now imagine. What if Africa had been invited to Westphalia? What if the Congo Kingdom had argued for recognition? What if Mali's scholars brought a communal model of diplomacy to Europe? Speculative thought allows us to reimagine sovereignty, not as an import, but as an African contribution to global order. A future beyond Westphalia? What if the African Union adopted variable sovereignty, allowing federations, regional states, and cultural zones to coexist? What if Pan-African citizenship replaced passports? What if borders became administrative, not political? These questions aren't fantasy. They're alternative futures, and Africa must ask them. Conclusion: toward a post-Westphalian Africa. The final reckoning. The Treaty of Westphalia shaped the world, but not for the betterment of Africa. It gave Europe peace and power. It gave Africa division and silence. From the Berlin Conference to the African Union, the continent has struggled within a system that was never built for it. The tools of sovereignty, non-interference, and territorial integrity have been used both to protect and to oppress. But Africa is not doomed to remain in this shadow. A new model of African sovereignty must emerge, one that reflects community, fluid identity, economic cooperation, and shared destiny. Not every African state must look the same. Not every border must remain sacred. Africa's future does not lie in rigid Westphalian boxes. It lies in the African imagination, bold, unified, and free. If this documentary gave you a new lens on Africa's political journey, don't just scroll. Subscribe, share, and join the conversation. We're rewriting history and reclaiming the future. This is Africa Politicos.